His wife grabbed her suitcase after seeing his mistress, and the Mafia Boss panicked. She wasn't supposed to come home for 2 more days. That's the only reason Unipark felt comfortable enough to sit at Nia Calloway's kitchen island, wearing Nia's anniversary robe, drinking from Nia's favorite porcelain cup, scrolling through her phone like the marble countertop beneath her belonged to her already. When Nia walked through that door at 11:40 at night, rolling a carry-on behind her, the first thing she noticed wasn't the woman. It was the robe, the champagne silk, the specific way the belt was knotted, left loop over right, then tucked under twice. Tae-jin's habit, a small, unconscious thing he'd done every single morning for 9 years. 4 seconds of silence passed. Then Nia set her bag down very quietly and walked upstairs. She didn't scream. She didn't demand answers. She didn't pick up her phone and call him. She simply pulled a black suitcase from the closet and started packing. And when Tae-jin, a man whose name made seasoned criminals lower their eyes, finally sprinted up those stairs and found his wife closing that suitcase with steady hands, something cracked open inside his chest that no amount of money or power had ever touched before. He was terrified, not of losing his empire, of losing her. If you've ever loved someone so deeply that losing them would feel like losing yourself, stay with me. Hit that subscribe button, because this channel tells the stories that don't make the headlines but live inside every one of us. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the beginning, because to understand why a mafia boss panicked, you have to understand the woman he never truly saw. Nia Calloway was 41 years old and had spent the better part of the last decade being invisible in plain sight. She wasn't invisible because she lacked presence. Anyone who met her understood within minutes that something serious lived behind her eyes. A stillness that wasn't passivity, a patience that wasn't weakness. She had the kind of bearing that made people choose their words more carefully around her, even when they couldn't explain why. She was invisible because of what the life she'd chosen required her to erase. 9 years earlier, she had been something else entirely. A pianist. Not the kind who played corporate cocktail hours in the background while men in suits talked over her. A real one. The kind who made an audience hold its breath through a difficult passage and then exhale all at once like they'd been underwater together. She'd trained since she was 6 years old. She'd composed her own pieces by the time she was 19. At 28, she'd been teaching at a Brooklyn conservatory and building towards something. Not fame exactly, but the specific and fragile confidence of a woman who had found the work she was made for. Then she met Tae-jin at a fundraiser she'd been hired to perform at, and everything changed in the way that enormous things change, gradually, then all at once. He hadn't tried to impress her that first night. That was the thing she remembered later, after everything. Most men who pursued her used money or status as their opening move. Tae-jin had simply listened to her play an entire set without checking his phone once, and then afterward, when she was packing up her sheet music, he'd stood nearby and said quietly, "The second movement. You paused half a beat before the resolution. Was that written that way, or did you decide that in the room?" Nobody had ever asked her that before. Nobody had ever noticed. She told him she'd decided it in the room because the audience needed a moment to catch up. He'd nodded slowly, like that was the most sensible thing he'd heard all evening. That was how it started. He was attentive in the beginning, intensely, almost uncomfortably attentive, the kind of focus that comes from a man who is used to studying threats and has turned that same precision towards something he wants. He attended her performances. He learned the names of composers she loved. He brought her scores from record shops he'd visited during business trips to Seoul and Tokyo, sliding them across dinner tables without ceremony. Just, "Thought you might not have this one." She fell in love with who he was then. The problem was who he became, or rather, who he had always been underneath, once the effort of pursuit gave way to the confidence of possession. Tae-jin wasn't cruel. That's the complicated truth that Nia had spent years turning over inside herself. He wasn't violent toward her, wasn't controlling in the obvious ways, never raised his hand or his voice in anger at her specifically. He was simply absent. Present in the room and absent from it simultaneously. His attention, once the most acute thing she had ever experienced, became a resource rationed carefully for boardrooms, conference calls, and the invisible war of maintaining an empire that operated in two worlds at once. And gradually, without either of them naming what was happening, Nia's life contracted to fit inside the space his left behind. Her first performance cancellation had seemed reasonable. A dinner with a business associate from Seoul who could only meet that particular evening. Important, Tae-jin had said, and she'd believed him. Her second cancellation was because the household staff had a crisis she needed to manage while he was traveling. Her third was because she'd been exhausted, genuinely exhausted, from months of playing the role of the gracious, composed wife of Seo Tae-jin, a role with no sheet music, no rehearsals, and no applause. By year 3, she had stopped scheduling performances altogether. By year 5, she had stopped composing. By year 7, she rarely sat at the piano in the music room they'd had built specifically for her, because she would sit down and her hands would find the keys and something would begin to emerge, something true and grief-shaped. And she wasn't ready to feel it directly, not in a house where someone might walk in. She told herself she was happy. She was good at her job. The household ran with precision. His legitimate business contacts respected her. His mother, Seo Hyeran, a woman not easily impressed by anything, had once told Nia in her particular blunt way, "You make him human. Don't underestimate what that is worth." She had taken that as a compliment. Later, she understood it was a warning. The charity trip to Washington had been Nia's initiative, a foundation she'd quietly been involved with for years. Arts education in public schools, children who had what she'd had at 6 years old and were being told it wasn't practical. She'd planned to be gone 4 days. She cut it short because something felt wrong. She couldn't name it precisely. It was a texture to Tae-jin's recent phone calls. Not what he said, but what he didn't. A flatness where warmth should have been. A careful quality to his language, like a man watching his own words. She'd been with him long enough to know the difference between Tae-jin, distracted by business, and Tae-jin managing something he hadn't decided to tell her yet. She'd told Imani Pierce, her closest friend since college, during a brief call that afternoon. "I'm coming home early." "Why?" Imani had asked. "I don't know yet." "That's not a reason, Nia." "Yes, it is." Imani had gone quiet for a moment. They had the kind of friendship built on years of knowing when not to argue. "Okay," she'd said finally. "Call me when you land." The car service dropped Nia at the gate at 11:20. The guards at the perimeter were attentive but strange, professional in their responses, eyes slightly too careful, movements that were controlled in a way that meant they had been told to appear casual. Nia noticed these things the way you notice the temperature drop before a storm. Not analysis exactly, just the body knowing before the mind. She let herself in through the side entrance with her key. The kitchen light was on. She heard music, faint, from somewhere. No, not music, a phone playing something in a room ahead. And then she rounded the corner and stopped. Unipark was 28 years old and had been Tae-jin's executive assistant for 14 months. Nia had met her several times at company functions. Pleasant, professional. The kind of young woman who made sure to laugh at the right moments and remember the names of spouses. Nothing had ever registered as alarming. Looking at her now, sitting at Nia's kitchen island in Nia's anniversary robe, drinking from the specific hand-painted porcelain cup Nia's mother had brought back from Oaxaca 20 years ago, not even looking up for the first full second because she was reading something on her phone. Nia felt something pass through her that was not quite emotion yet. It was recognition. The particular feeling of understanding something completely that you have been half-knowing for a while. Yuna looked up. Her face went white. Nia's eyes moved to the robe's belt. Left loop over right, tucked under twice. Tae-jin's knot. "Mrs. Seo," Yuna started. "Don't." Nia's voice was not raised. It was not shaking. It was the voice of a woman who had spent 9 years learning how to hold everything steady, regardless of what was happening underneath. "Don't say anything." She turned around. She walked upstairs. The bedroom was empty. Tae-jin was not home. She would learn later that he'd been at a meeting that ran past midnight, the sort of meeting he never discussed in detail, which had always been one of the rules of their life together that she had accepted without examining too hard. What she did not know then, and would not learn until much later, was that Yuna's presence in the house tonight had not been Tae-jin's arrangement. He had not invited her there. Yuna had her own key, a fact whose existence said enough on its own. And she had let herself in, and the comfort with which she'd installed herself in Nia's kitchen, wearing Nia's robe, drinking from Nia's cup, was the comfort of a woman who had made that calculation and decided she had time. Nia did not know any of this yet. She pulled the black suitcase from the shelf in the back of the walk-in closet. Not the matched luggage set from their honeymoon, the expensive Italian leather she never used because it felt like a prop. The plain black one she'd owned since before she met him. The one with her initials on the tag in her own handwriting, N.C., Nia Calloway. Not Mrs. Seo. Not Nia Seo. Nia Calloway. She packed deliberately. Her mother's photograph from the nightstand. Not the frame, just the photograph, folding it with both hands. Her grandmother's gold bracelet from the velvet box in the drawer. 7 dresses, the ones that felt like hers rather than like costumes for a role she'd been performing. A cardigan. Her old composition notebooks, 3 of them, the ones with her handwriting in the margins, filled with musical notation and half-sentences she'd never finished. She left the diamonds, both hands worth, left them in the tray where they lived. She left the pearl earrings he'd had made specifically for her 40th birthday. She left the framed photograph from their wedding on the dresser. She closed the suitcase, pressed the latches until they clicked. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, hands in her lap, when she heard the front door downstairs. The particular sound of Tae-jin entering his own house. The door code. The specific pattern of his footfall, unhurried until they weren't. A pause at the kitchen level that lasted too long. Then feet on the stairs, faster. The bedroom door opened. Tae-jin stood in the doorway in his dark suit, tie loosened, and he looked at the suitcase. Then he looked at her face. And something she had never seen before moved across his. Not the controlled concern of a man managing a situation, not the practiced steadiness of someone who handled crises professionally. Raw fear. Nia, I know about the robe, she said. Not loudly, not with tears, just a statement. I know about the knot. He opened his mouth, closed it. He was a man who negotiated for a living, on legitimate tables and less legitimate ones. A man whose composure in difficult conversations was legendary within his world. He had sat across from people who wanted him dead and kept his voice level and his hands still. He couldn't find a single word. You can explain it, she said. I'm sure you can. You're very good at explaining things. It's not. Don't. She stood up. Please don't tell me what it is or isn't. I'm not asking. He moved into the room, not reaching for her, not yet. Some instinct telling him that the wrong move right now would be irreversible. Just talk to me. Don't do whatever this is. I'm packing a bag, Tae-jin. That's what this is. You're not leaving. She looked at him then, fully, the way she hadn't in a long time. And what she said next, she said quietly, without performance, without the trembling delivery of a dramatic moment. She said it the way a person states something they have finally, completely understood. I'm not leaving my home. She picked up the suitcase handle. I'm leaving yours. She walked toward the door. His hand moved, not grabbing, just landing on the doorframe, an instinctive barrier. He was 6'2" and he filled the space. Outside that door were 4 of his men, positioned in the hallway because that was how this house worked. Because this had always been how this house worked. Nia stopped. She looked at his hand on the frame, then at his face. Are you going to stop me? She asked. Not a challenge, not theatrical. An honest question, with weight behind it. 4 seconds. He moved his hand. She walked through. His men stepped aside without being told. One of them, Marcus, who'd worked security here for 6 years, who'd driven Nia to her mother's funeral 2 years ago and sat in the parking lot for 3 hours without complaining, looked at the floor. Nobody stopped her. The front door opened. The night air hit her face. She did not look back. And Seo Tae-jin, who had never lost anything in his adult life that he hadn't decided to release, stood at the top of his staircase in the home his family had built, from violence and money and the labor of people who feared his name, and understood for the first time, with the particular clarity of a man watching something irreplaceable walk out of reach, that there were things in this world that power could not retrieve. His wife was one of them. Tae-jin stood at the top of that staircase for a long time after the front door closed. Nobody spoke to him. Nobody moved. The 4 men positioned in the hallway found reasons to look at walls, at floors, at the middle distance of nowhere in particular. Marcus, the one who had driven Nia to her mother's funeral, had his hands clasped in front of him and his jaw set in the specific way of a man swallowing something he will not say out loud. The gate camera feed showed Nia's silhouette moving down the driveway. She didn't call a car from inside the house. She must have called one from the road or walked to the nearest intersection where a car couldn't be traced back through his accounts. He didn't know. He realized he didn't know how his own wife would navigate leaving him, what she knew or didn't know about the ways his world worked, what she had been quietly observing and filing away for 9 years of living inside a fortress. He turned around and walked back into the bedroom. The velvet tray on the dresser held her diamonds, both rings, the earrings from her 40th birthday, the tennis bracelet she wore to formal events. She had taken nothing he'd given her except the composition notebooks and her grandmother's bracelet, which had existed before him. He stood there looking at the tray for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and called Min-kyu. His cousin answered on the second ring, which meant he was awake, which meant he already knew something had happened. Min-kyu had eyes on the estate feed the same as everyone else in the inner circle. "Boss?" "Find out where she goes," Tae-jin said. "Don't approach. Don't send anyone near her. Just find out where she lands." "Understood." "And Min-kyu." He paused. "If I find out anyone on my team said a word to her tonight, or that anyone knew about any of this before tonight and didn't tell me, I'll handle it." Tae-jin ended the call. He sat on the edge of the bed, her side, not his, without consciously choosing it, and put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands. Downstairs, he heard the sound of the side door opening and closing quietly. Yuna leaving. He had forgotten she was still there. The fact that he had forgotten she was still there told him something about the relative weight of the two women in that house tonight, and the knowledge of it sat in his chest like something swallowed wrong. He did not go downstairs. He sat in the dark until 4 in the morning, when he finally lay back on the bed without undressing and stared at the ceiling. He did not sleep. Imani Pierce lived in a third-floor walk-up in Carroll Gardens, Brooklyn, in an apartment that was too small for 2 people and had been that way for the 12 years she'd lived there alone by choice. The radiator made a sound like a dying animal in winter. The kitchen window looked directly into the kitchen window of the building across the alley, close enough that Imani and her neighbor had conducted an entire ongoing relationship of nods and occasional shared expressions of exhaustion without ever learning each other's name. She buzzed Nia in at 12:47 in the morning without asking who it was, because Nia had texted from the car. When Nia appeared in the doorway with a single black suitcase and her coat, and the absolute absence of any expression that Imani recognized as distress, because Nia's distress had never looked like other people's distress. It looked like stillness, like a room with all the windows shut. Imani stepped back and let her in and didn't say anything for a full minute. She put the kettle on. Nia sat at the kitchen table and set her bag beside the chair and took off her coat and folded it over the back. Her movements were exact, not robotic, exact. The difference being that robotic meant the feeling was gone and exact meant the feeling was still there, contained very carefully, managed with both hands. "The guest room's clean," Imani said from the kitchen. "Thank you." "You eat?" "On the plane." "That was 4 hours ago." "I'm not hungry." Imani brought 2 mugs to the table and sat down across from her. She looked at Nia's face for a long moment. "Tell me what happened." Nia told her, not with tears, not with the shaking voice of a woman newly devastated. She told it the way you tell something you have already moved through the worst part of, and what remains is just the describing of it. The robe, the cup, the knot, the suitcase. What she said to him at the door. When she finished, Imani wrapped her hands around her mug and said, "The knot." "Yes. You walked out because of a knot." "I walked out because of 9 years." Nia looked at her. "The knot was just the last thing." Imani nodded slowly. She didn't argue with that. She'd been watching the last thing approach for longer than Nia probably knew, and she'd made the decision a long time ago that it wasn't her place to name it before Nia did. You don't do that to someone you love. You wait. And when they finally arrive at the thing themselves, you don't say "I told you" or "I knew." You just move over and make room. "He's going to send people," Imani said. "I know." "Here?" "Probably. I'll tell him through you that if anyone comes near this building, I won't take his calls. Ever." Imani raised her eyebrows slightly. "And you think that'll work?" For the first time since she'd walked through the door, something moved across Nia's face that was almost dark humor. He knows me well enough to know I mean it. That's the one thing he never questioned. Minkyu's report came back by 7 the next morning. Carroll Gardens. A woman named Imani Pierce, known associate. No criminal history. No financial connection to any of Tae-jin's networks. Clean. Tae-jin looked at the address for 30 seconds and then put the paper face down on his desk. He sent 2 men to the block. Not to approach. To be present, visible, the way his world expressed concern through surveillance. Standard procedure. By 10 that morning, Imani Pierce had texted a number that routed back to Minkyu's secondary line. Tell him if anyone is on this block by noon, she changes her number and doesn't take calls. Those are her words. She asked me to add, she means it. Tae-jin recalled the men. The decision cost him something, not strategically, but personally, in the private internal accounting of a man who had spent decades equating control with safety, who had built systems of observation and response precisely because he could not tolerate the vulnerability of not knowing. Pulling those men back meant accepting a gap in his information, a person in his life who was now outside his reach, and doing it consciously, deliberately, because she had asked. He did it anyway. Then he sat in his office at Sioran Holdings, on the 42nd floor with the Hudson visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and tried to run a company. He managed 3 hours before his assistant, a different one, a man named Jong-hyun, who had worked for him for 6 years, came in with a message that his mother had called 4 times, and was now, according to Jong-hyun's carefully neutral phrasing, expressing a preference for a return call at your earliest convenience. Tae-jin knew what that meant. He called her at noon. Seo Hyeran was 69 years old and had been running the family's affairs in one capacity or another since her husband died 18 years earlier. She was small and deliberate, and wore her silver hair in a way that suggested she had not required anyone's approval for her appearance in several decades. She had survived things that Tae-jin knew about in outline and suspected were worse in detail, and she had done it without ever allowing anyone to mistake her grief for weakness. She spoke Korean with him when she was making a point. She was speaking Korean now. "You're going to tell me it's complicated," she said. "Iyama. Don't. I didn't raise you to start sentences you intend to use as cushions." He was quiet. "How long?" she said. Not a question. He answered it anyway. "Several months." The silence on the other end was the particular silence of a woman who is deciding how much of what she feels she is willing to weaponize. Did you think she wouldn't find out, or did you simply stop caring whether she did? That one landed exactly where she intended it to. "I don't know," he said, because it was the honest answer, and she would have recognized anything else. "That's worse," Hyeran said. "Deliberate cruelty is a kind of calculation. Not knowing means you stopped paying attention. A man who stops paying attention to his wife has already left the marriage. He just hasn't had the decency to move his body yet." "I know. Nia made that house into a home. She did it for you. She did it quietly, without asking for recognition, because that is who she is. And because you gave her the impression that was what you needed from her. Did you ever ask her what she needed from you?" He didn't answer. "I'm going to come to the house," she said. "Not for you. To make sure things are managed appropriately, since apparently you've been managing them with your eyes closed." She ended the call. Tae-jin set the phone down and looked at the Hudson for a long time. But Yaran arrived at the mansion 2 days later with a single bag and her reading glasses and the expression of a woman conducting a building inspection. She walked through the rooms methodically, and Tae-jin followed her because he'd learned 20 years ago that following was the only reasonable option when she moved through a space this way. She stopped in the music room. The piano sat exactly as it had for years. A Steinway concert grand, maintained by a tuner who came quarterly, never dusty because the household staff kept it immaculate, never played because the woman it had been bought for had stopped playing. Hyeran pressed a single key. The note rang out and decayed in the still room. "When did she stop?" Hyeran asked. Tae-jin thought about it. "Around year 5, I think." "You think?" "She stopped gradually. There wasn't a specific, and you didn't ask why." He said nothing. Hyeran turned to look at her son. She was significantly shorter than him, and it made no difference. "You took the most alive part of her and let it die because it was inconvenient, and you replaced it with nothing except the expectation that she would continue." She paused. She will not come back to this house. You don't know that. I know women. I know what it means when one of them packs without breaking anything. She moved toward the door. It means she made up her mind a long time before she walked out. The robe was simply the last thing she was willing to absorb. That phrase hit him somewhere low and specific, because it was exactly what he'd been circling around for 3 days without landing on. Brooklyn moved at a different pace than the life Nia had left. The Carroll Gardens apartment was genuinely small, and she had to store her suitcase under Imani's guest bed and navigate the bathroom on a schedule, and the radiator made a sound at 2 in the morning that the first night woke her completely, and the second night she slept through because her body had already accepted it as a feature rather than an anomaly. She had not called Tae-jin. He had not called her directly, which meant he was respecting the terms she'd communicated through Imani, which surprised her slightly and didn't surprise her at all. Tae-jin was many things, but he had always understood leverage, and he was smart enough to know that calling her now would cost him more than it gained. On the 4th morning, she found herself standing in Imani's living room at 6:15, in the particular gray-blue light of early Brooklyn, staring at the old upright piano against the far wall. Imani had played piano through high school and had stopped for the same reason most people stopped. Not lack of love for it, but the accumulation of other things that occupied the space. The upright had sat in the living room for years as something between furniture and intention. Its keys were slightly yellowed. 2 of the lower register hammers were soft in a way that muffled certain notes. Nia sat down on the bench. She didn't play immediately. She put her hands in her lap and looked at the keys for a moment. Then she placed both hands in position, not starting anything, just contact, just the weight of her palms across the ivory and the specific, irreplaceable feeling of the instrument responding to her presence with its silence. She played a scale, then another. Then she played 4 bars of something she had started composing in year 2 of her marriage, during a week when Tae-jin had been in Seoul for business, and she'd been alone in the Hudson mansion with nothing but time and a Steinway she hadn't yet learned to stop using. She had never finished it. She'd put it in one of the composition notebooks, labeled it with a date and no title, and eventually stopped returning to it. Her hands remembered it exactly. The soft hammer in the left hand muddied one note, but she worked around it, and the composition came out of her like water finding level. Not effortful, not triumphant, just inevitable, like something that had always known where it was going even when she wasn't listening. Imani appeared in the hallway in her bathrobe, holding a coffee mug, hair undone. She leaned against the doorframe and didn't say anything. Nia played for 40 minutes. When she stopped, the room held the silence for a moment, the way a room does after music, differently than it holds ordinary quiet. I forgot, Nia said. Which part? Imani asked. That I could do that. She looked at her hands. I forgot that it was mine. Not the piano, not the performance, the thing inside it, that part. She turned on the bench. I forgot it was mine. She called Celeste Rowan that afternoon. Celeste was the director of the Briar Street Conservatory in Brooklyn, a performing arts institution that operated on a budget that required constant creative accounting and produced, consistently and stubbornly, musicians of extraordinary quality from a neighborhood that the music industry had generally declined to pay attention to. She and Nia had known each other from before Tae-jin, from the years when Nia had taught there, before her schedule had been reorganized by marriage and its obligations. Celeste answered the phone with, I heard you were back in Brooklyn. News travels. This is a small building full of musicians, Nia. Nothing is private. A pause. Are you all right? I'm functional. That's not what I asked. It's the accurate answer. Nia sat at Imani's kitchen table, the composition notebook open in front of her. I was wondering if you had any teaching availability. Celeste was quiet for a moment, and Nia could hear in that silence the rapid internal calculation of a woman managing more commitments than she had hours for, weighing them against a person she genuinely cared about. I have 3 classes, she said finally. Adult beginners Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Youth composition workshop Saturday morning. None of them pay what you deserve, but all of them need what you have. I'll take them. All 3? Yes. Another pause. Nia, are you sure you're all right? I need to work, Nia said. I need to earn money with my own name on it. I need to wake up in the morning with somewhere to be that belongs to me. She stopped. I'm not all right yet, but I'm going to be. Celeste said, Tuesday at 6. The beginners will destroy you in the best way possible. Tae-jin was running on 4 hours of sleep and controlled fury when Min-kyu appeared in his office on a Wednesday morning and closed the door behind him, which meant the news was for the room and not for the hallway. Min-kyu was 37 and had been operating as Tae-jin's intelligence chief for 9 years, longer than almost anyone in the inner circle. He was precise the way a surgical tool is precise. Not cold, but calibrated. The kind of man who brought you information in the exact temperature you needed it at, with the context required and nothing decorative added. He put a folder on the desk. Seorin Holdings has a leak, he said. Tae-jin looked at him. Shipping schedules, the Bayonne acquisition documents, the restructuring plan for the Pacific Logistics contracts. Min-kyu sat in the chair across the desk. Someone has been feeding confidential internal information to a third party. The pattern goes back at least 7 months. 7 months. Tae-jin absorbed that number. Which third party? Still working on the destination, but the origin. Min-kyu tapped the folder. The access pattern points to a single user account with executive-level permissions. The documents are being accessed at irregular hours, copied through an internal system gap, and routed out through a secondary channel we haven't fully traced. Which account? Min-kyu looked at him steadily. Unipark's administrative access. The room got very quiet. Tae-jin did not react visibly, which was a kind of reaction in itself. The particular stillness of a man who has just received information that reorganizes everything he thought he understood and is forcing himself to process it without breaking anything. You're certain. Certain enough to bring it to you directly. Tae-jin stood up and walked to the window. The Hudson was slate gray in the morning light. He stood with his back to Min-kyu for a full 30 seconds. Who's she routing to? He said finally. That's what I'm still building, but the volume of what's been accessed. Min-kyu's voice stayed even. Boss, this isn't opportunistic. Someone organized this. She had help on the receiving end, and whoever that is has been planning something specific with what they've been getting. Tae-jin turned around. His face was composed in the way that meant nothing on the surface and everything underneath. How long have you known? I've had the access anomalies flagged for 3 weeks. I spent that time building the confirmation before I brought it to you because I needed to be sure, and because... Min-kyu paused, choosing his words. Because I knew what it would mean when you heard it. What it would mean, not just a security breach, not just corporate espionage, but the shape of it. Who? How long? Who else might have known? What else might be connected to what else? The affair. The information access. The specific timing. Tae-jin said very quietly, Find out who she's working with, full trace. I want names before Friday. Yes. And Min-kyu. He waited until his cousin looked at him directly. Nobody outside this room until I say. Min-kyu picked up the folder and left. Tae-jin stood at the window and understood, with the slow and nauseating clarity of a man watching a picture resolve into a shape he should have seen coming, that his marriage had not simply broken. It had been broken deliberately by people who understood exactly how to use a man's arrogance against him, and he had handed them the tool himself, with both hands, and never once looked down to see what he was holding. His phone buzzed on the desk. A notification from the external PR team about a scheduled statement regarding Seorin Holdings' charitable partnerships. He turned the phone face down. Outside, the Hudson moved indifferently south, gray and cold, and completely without interest in the calculations of the man watching it from 42 floors above. On a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after she left, Nia was alone in the main rehearsal hall at the Briar Street Conservatory. The adult beginners had cleared out 20 minutes earlier. One of them, a 63-year-old retired postal worker named Gerald, who had promised his late wife he would learn piano before he died, had replayed the same 4 bars of a simplified Bach piece 11 times in the session and gotten it right exactly once, on the 9th attempt. And his face when it landed correctly was the kind of face that made Nia remember why she had wanted to teach in the first place. She was gathering her sheet music when she sat down at the conservatory's upright, a better instrument than Imani's properly maintained, all hammers working, and began to play. Not for herself, not consciously. She was thinking about Gerald's hands on the keys, the specific quality of concentration he brought to each attempt, the way he refused to be defeated by his own fingers. and without deciding to, she began to play the composition from the notebook. The one she'd started in year 2. The one she'd been slowly returning to, adding measures, finding the next phrase, during the quiet hours before Imani woke up. She played it through from the beginning. And then she played the new material she'd added this week, the part she wasn't sure about yet, the part that came from somewhere she hadn't looked at directly in years. She didn't know that a junior staff member named Deshaun had walked back in to retrieve a forgotten jacket. She didn't know he had stopped in the doorway with his phone already in his hand. Not deliberately, it was just already in his hand. And that he had pressed record because he was 24 years old and understood instinctively that the thing happening in front of him was the kind of thing you don't see twice. He recorded 4 minutes and 17 seconds. He posted it that night with the caption, "Don't know who she is, but she's playing like she's talking to someone who isn't in the room anymore." By the following morning, the video had been shared 800 times. By the afternoon, it had cleared 200,000 views. By the time Nia found out about it, through Celeste, who texted her a link at 4:17 p.m. with the words, "You need to see this right now," it had 250,000 and climbing, and a comment section full of strangers asking the same question in 17 different languages. Who is she? Where has she been? And underneath all of them, buried in the thread but rising slowly, as people kept finding it and pressing the small upward arrow. "I don't know, but whatever happened to her, she put all of it in that music. You can hear exactly where it broke." Nia sat in Imani's kitchen and watched the view counter move and felt something complicated and large shift inside her chest. Not quite grief, not quite relief, not quite pride, but something that contained elements of all three and didn't have a cleaner name than this. She had been found, not by Tae-jin, not by his world, not by any of the machinery of wealth and reputation that had defined her for 9 years, by strangers who heard something real and recognized it. Her phone lit up with a number she didn't recognize, a 323 area code, Los Angeles. She let it go to voicemail. The message was from a man named Raymond Okafor, who identified himself as a producer and said he had seen the video and wanted to talk, and that he understood if she had 100 of these calls coming in right now, but that he hoped she would give him 5 minutes because he had an idea, and he thought she might be ready to hear it. Nia listened to the voicemail twice. Then she set the phone down and looked at Imani, who was sitting across the table watching her face. "Someone wants to talk to me," Nia said. "About my music." "Your music," Imani repeated. "Yes." Imani said nothing. She just nodded, slowly, like a woman watching something long overdue finally arrive. And in that small kitchen in Carroll Gardens, with the radiator beginning its evening complaint and the neighbor's light coming on across the alley, Nia Calloway sat with the knowledge that the world had just heard her, not as a wife, not as a presence attached to someone else's name, but as herself. It was the most frightening thing that had happened to her in weeks. It was also the only thing, in longer than she could precisely measure, that felt entirely and completely true. Raymond Okafor called back the next morning at 9:15, and this time Nia picked up. He had a voice that moved at an unhurried pace, the kind of voice that had learned through experience that the fastest way to earn someone's attention was to not seem like you needed it. He told her he'd watched the video 6 times. He told her he wasn't calling to make her famous, because he understood that wasn't the thing the video was about. He told her the video was about a woman who had something to say and had found a way to say it that didn't require anyone's permission, and that in his 20 years of working with musicians, that specific quality, that particular combination of technical mastery and emotional nakedness, appeared maybe once a decade if you were paying attention. Nia listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "What are you proposing?" "A conversation," he said. "In person if you're willing. I'll come to New York. No contracts in the room, no lawyers, no agenda, except me asking you what you want and you telling me the truth." She thought about it for 10 seconds. "Next week," she said. "I'll give you an hour." "I'll take it," he said, and she could hear that he meant it. She put the phone down and sat with the quiet of Imani's kitchen and understood that something had shifted in the architecture of her situation. 4 weeks ago, she had left a mansion with a single suitcase. Now a producer from Los Angeles was flying to New York to sit across a table from her. The trajectory of that movement was not lost on her, but she was careful, deliberately, consciously careful, not to let the speed of it carry her somewhere she hadn't chosen to go. She had spent 9 years being carried. She was done with that particular mode of travel. She opened her composition notebook and went back to work. The video found Tae-jin on a Friday, forwarded by Min-kyu with no comment attached, which was Min-kyu's precise way of saying, "You need to see this, and I am not going to tell you how to feel about it." Tae-jin watched it twice at his desk with the door closed. 4 minutes and 17 seconds of his wife playing a piano in a room she'd borrowed in a building she was working in a borough she'd retreated to with a single bag, and the comment section underneath full of strangers who had never met her and had understood her completely from the sound alone. He watched her hands, the way they moved across the keys without hesitation, without the careful reserve he had occasionally witnessed in those last years when she still played at home. Infrequently, briefly, always seeming slightly like she was apologizing for taking up the room's attention. There was no apology in this. There was something he could only describe, even privately, as fury. Not the destructive kind, but the generative kind, the kind that comes from a person who has finally decided to stop managing themselves for other people's comfort. He closed the laptop. Then he opened it and watched it a third time. When Jong-hyun knocked to remind him he had a board call in 8 minutes, Tae-jin said, "Push it 30 minutes." And Jong-hyun said, "Yes, sir." And the door closed again. He sat in the silence of his office with the Hudson gray and cold outside and tried to identify what he was feeling with the same precision he brought to everything else. And what he found underneath the complexity was something that had very little sophistication to it. He was proud of her. The recognition of that, its simplicity, its completeness, the way it arrived without any self-interest attached, was followed immediately by something much harder. Because pride in someone else's survival of you is not a comfortable emotion. It sits adjacent to grief, and it requires a particular kind of honesty about your own role in creating the conditions that made their survival necessary. He had not been her audience. He had been her obstacle. And she had found her music again anyway, in a borrowed apartment on an instrument that probably hadn't been tuned in 3 years, and put it on the internet for strangers. And the strangers had understood it immediately in a way he had spent 9 years failing to. He pushed the laptop away. He had a board call to run. Min-kyu came back with names on a Thursday morning, 6 days after the video and 8 days before anything else. And he came in person to Tae-jin's home office rather than the Seorin Holdings building, because what he had to say required a room without the building's security cameras in it. He laid 3 photographs on the desk. "Kwon Dae-sik," he said. Tae-jin looked at the face in the first photograph. Kwon Dae-sik was 44 years old, a senior lieutenant who controlled a significant portion of Seorin's port operations in Newark and Bayonne. He had been with the organization for 11 years. He was careful, consistent, never flashy, never the kind of man who generated problems that landed on Tae-jin's desk. The kind of man who was trusted precisely because he was so aggressively unremarkable. "He's the receiving end," Min-kyu said. "The documents Yuna accessed, shipping schedules, the Bayonne acquisition files, the Pacific restructuring plan, all of it went through a routing architecture that traces back to Dae-sik. He built the channel. She used it." Tae-jin looked at the second photograph. A restaurant in Midtown. Dae-sik and Yuna at a corner table, 2 months before Nia found her in the kitchen. Taken by one of Min-kyu's people who had been watching Dae-sik for unrelated reasons. "How long have they been in contact?" Tae-jin asked. "The relationship started approximately 14 months ago, around when she joined your office." 14 months. The math was immediate and unwelcome. Yuna had been placed, or had positioned herself, the distinction mattered, and he didn't have it yet, in his executive office 14 months ago. Within weeks, she had been inside his confidence professionally. Within months, by his own failure of judgment, inside his personal life. 14 months of access. "What went out?" Tae-jin said. Min-kyu's expression didn't change, but something in it tightened slightly. Enough to map the full structure of the port operations. The Bayonne acquisition would have given whoever Dae-sik is working with a significant foothold in the Eastern distribution network. The Pacific restructuring plan, he paused. If the right people had that information 6 weeks ago, they could have positioned to undercut Seorin's carrier contracts before the new cycle locked in. "Who is Dae-sik working for?" "A consortium," Min-kyu said. 3 parties that I can confirm, 2 more I'm still building. The center of it is the Jong network out of Flushing. They've been looking for a way into the port operations for 4 years. Dae-sik gave them the door. The Jong network. Tae-jin set that name aside in the part of his mind reserved for things requiring a calibrated response rather than an immediate one. Jung Sung-won had been a peripheral irritant for years, a man who operated at the edges of the same world, ambitious enough to be dangerous, but historically not organized enough to threaten anything structural. Apparently that had changed. And Yuna, Tae-jin said, was she placed, or did she make the arrangement herself? Min-kyu picked up the third photograph. This one I'm less certain about. The evidence suggests she came into the role with the intention that the job application itself was engineered. But I can't confirm yet whether she approached Dae-sik or Dae-sik approached her. That distinction matters, Tae-jin said. Yes. He leaned back. The leather of the chair made a small sound. Outside the window, one of the groundsmen was raking near the garden wall, a methodical back-and-forth motion that Tae-jin tracked without seeing for several seconds while he thought. She used the affair, he said finally. It wasn't a question. The affair gave her full access to the residence, to your personal schedule, your communication patterns, your unguarded hours. Whatever she learned from proximity added to what she was extracting professionally. She was never here for me. Min-kyu said nothing. The affair was the cover, Tae-jin said. The words came out flat and specific. She wasn't in my kitchen that night because she'd made herself comfortable. She was in my kitchen that night because she wanted Nia to find her. The room was very quiet. You think she staged it, Min-kyu said carefully. I think a woman who had 14 months of access to my schedule and full knowledge of my wife's travel plans would know exactly when to put herself in that kitchen, in that robe. He stopped. I think she knew Nia came back early and she stayed anyway, because Nia walking out served the purpose better than Nia staying. Min-kyu absorbed this. A destabilized personal situation means a distracted leader. It means a man making decisions without sleeping, with his household in crisis, with his attention divided between his marriage and his organization, which is exactly when you move on the contracts. Tae-jin stood up. He walked to the window and stood there for a moment, not at the Hudson this time, but at the garden wall, at the groundsman's methodical work, at the ordinary patience of a man doing something simple. The affair was mine, he said, and his voice had changed, quieter, stripped of everything except the specific weight of accountability. The choice was mine. She made it easy, but I made it. He turned around. I need that to be clear between us. Min-kyu held his gaze. It's clear. Nia's suffering was used. People looked at my marriage failing and saw an opening. I handed it to them. He picked up the photographs from the desk and stacked them precisely. Begin the asset freeze on Day 6 operational accounts. Don't move on him yet. I want the full map of the consortium before anyone knows we have it. Yuna? Remove her access to everything effective immediately, quietly. I want it done in a way that looks like routine security rotation. He paused. She doesn't know what we know yet. I want that gap. And the Jung network? I'll handle that in my own time. He handed the photographs back to Min-kyu. Close the door on your way out. He sat alone in the office for a long time after Min-kyu left. He thought about the specific night he'd first crossed a line with Yuna, 4 months into her employment, at a late night at the office that had extended past 11 because of a crisis in the Pacific operations that required continuous attention. He thought about how it had happened with the particular momentum of small decisions. One drink, one conversation that ran longer than it should have, one moment of choosing not to stop. He thought about how none of it had felt like betrayal in the moment, because he had spent so long in a marriage that felt empty of connection that he had reframed the emptiness as something Nia had created, rather than something they had both, but mostly, he had, allowed to happen. He thought about Nia's hands on the piano. He thought about the fact that she had never stopped being extraordinary, that her gift had not diminished in 5 years of disuse, that it had simply been waiting, with the patience of something that belongs to a person absolutely and cannot be permanently taken, only temporarily abandoned. He thought about the fact that he had watched her abandon it and had not asked why. And underneath all of it, underneath the strategic calculations, the organization's crisis, the names on Min-kyu's photographs, a much simpler and more personal understanding was assembling itself in the back of his chest. He had been the architect of his own loss. Not because Yuna had maneuvered him, not because Dae-sik had seen an opening, But because he had built a marriage that looked solid from the outside and was hollow at its center, and he had furnished that hollowness with expensive things and arranged absences and the assumption that Nia's patience was infinite, and then he had been surprised, genuinely, stupidly surprised, when it turned out to have a limit. He was not a man accustomed to being stupid. The recognition of it sat in him like something he had swallowed wrong and could not go back and take out. Nia met Raymond Okafor at a small coffee shop in Park Slope on a Tuesday morning, chosen because it was not the kind of place anyone connected to Tae-jin's world would think to look for her, and also because it had good light and she'd needed good light lately. Raymond was in his mid-50s, solidly built, with reading glasses he kept taking off and putting back on, and he arrived 7 minutes early and was already at the table when she walked in, which she noted because it told her something about how seriously he was taking the meeting. He stood when she came in, gestured to the seat across from him without ceremony. They ordered coffee. He didn't lead with business. He asked her how long she'd been teaching at the conservatory, and she told him, and he asked her what the students were like, and she told him about Gerald and the Bach passage and the 9th attempt, and he laughed, a real laugh, unpracticed, and said, "That's the whole thing right there. That's what people are missing." "What thing?" "The part where it's hard," he said. "The industry spent 20 years convincing people that what they want is effortless, polished, produced until the humanity is out of it." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "That video has 4 million views now." She blinked. "As of when?" "This morning." He watched her face process it. "People are sending it to their mothers, their fathers. People who haven't thought about music in 30 years are watching a woman play piano in a conservatory in Brooklyn, and something is happening to them." He leaned forward slightly. "Do you know what they're responding to?" "What?" "The feeling that she's not performing for them. That they happen to witness something private." He paused. "Can you make a record that sounds like that?" Nia looked at him for a long moment. "What kind of record?" "Your compositions. Your terms. Recorded the way that video was recorded. Not stripped down as an aesthetic choice, but because that's what the music actually sounds like when you're not managing it for an audience." He sat back. "I don't want to produce you into something. I want to document what's already there." She looked at the table, at her hands around her own coffee cup. "I'd need to finish the compositions," she said. "How long?" "I don't know. 3 months? Maybe 4? Some of them are close. Some of them I haven't touched in years, and I'd need to find out what they still are." "Take 4 months," he said immediately. "I'd need full creative control." "Yes." "I'd need to record at a location I choose." "Yes." "And I'd need to understand the financial structure completely before anything is signed." "I'll have our lawyer send the full term sheet to whoever you want to review it. No pressure calendar. You set the review timeline." She studied him. He didn't flinch under it. He had the particular stillness of a man who had been in enough rooms to know that the most dangerous thing you could do in a negotiation was to be more eager than the person across the table. "Why me?" she said. "Specifically, there are better-known musicians. There are people the industry would consider lower risk." He picked up his glasses and put them back down. "Because most of the musicians the industry considers lower risk have already been taught how to be safe," he said. "You haven't. You've been off the grid for almost a decade, and instead of making you timid, it made you—" He gestured vaguely at the space between them. "Whatever that video is. I don't see lower risk. I see someone who has nothing left to prove and everything left to say." Nia picked up her coffee. She drank it. She looked at the morning light coming through the window, and at the ordinary street outside, and at her own reflection faint in the glass. "Send me the term sheet," she said. "Boy." 3 days later, Min-kyu walked into Tae-jin's office with the expression of a man carrying weight he'd rather put down quickly. "Daesik knows we've been looking," he said. Tae-jin set his pen down. "How?" "Someone inside the organization tipped him. I don't have the source yet, but I will." Min-kyu sat without being invited. "He's moved the operational accounts we were planning to freeze. Not all of them. He didn't have time, but enough to complicate the asset picture." "What else?" "He's requested an emergency meeting with Jong Seung-won. My contact in Flushing says the meeting is happening tonight." Min-kyu paused. "If Jong decides to accelerate the timeline and move on the port contracts before we can, What's the timetable on the Bayonne acquisition documentation? Tae-jin cut in. Legal can file the protective claim by end of week, but it's thin without the full paper trail. Get me the full paper trail by Wednesday. Tae-jin. Min-kyu rarely used his name without the honorific. It meant he was speaking as family, not as an employee. If Daisik has already moved assets and he's meeting with Jong tonight, our window to do this quietly is closing. If Jong's people move on the carrier contracts before we lock them down, we're not just looking at a financial hit. We're looking at a structural vulnerability in the port operations that other parties will see and read as weakness. Tae-jin picked up his pen again, set it down again. What are you saying? I'm saying the calculated approach was built on having time we may no longer have. And I'm saying that you're not sleeping and you're making decisions under conditions that, are you questioning my judgment? The room held the tension of that for a moment. Min-kyu met his gaze. I'm telling you the conditions, he said evenly. What you do with them is your decision. It always has been. Tae-jin stood up. He walked to the window. The Hudson was dark today, heavy-looking under a sky that couldn't decide whether to rain. Set up a meeting with Park Jin-ho at the Port Authority, he said finally. Not through official channels, personal contact. Jin-ho is day 6 contact there. I know. Tae-jin turned around. Which means Jin-ho is currently trying to decide which direction this goes. I want to have that conversation before day 6 does. Min-kyu nodded and stood. There's one more thing. Something in his cousin's tone made Tae-jin look at him carefully. The concert, Min-kyu said, at the Morrison Theater, 2 weeks. Tae-jin was still for a moment. What about it? I have a ticket, anonymous purchase, back row, the way you asked. He reached into his jacket and set the ticket envelope on the desk. I thought you should have it now rather than closer to the date. In case the situation at the ports... I'll be there, Tae-jin said. Min-kyu looked at him for a moment with something that was not quite readable and then said, yes, sir, and left. Tae-jin looked at the ticket envelope on his desk. Beside it, the financial reports, the legal documents, the photographs of Daisik and Yuna. Beside all of that, the pen he had been using to annotate a contract restructuring that required his full concentration. He picked up the ticket envelope. He put it in his inside jacket pocket, and he stood there in the weight of everything that was simultaneously collapsing and expanding around him. His organization, his marriage, his understanding of how thoroughly he had been outmaneuvered, and the specific private knowledge that in 2 weeks a woman he had failed was going to walk onto a stage in Manhattan and play music that had been waiting inside her for years while he had been looking elsewhere. He was going to be there, whatever happened between now and then. Why? Yuna Park understood that something had changed on a Wednesday afternoon when her access card failed at the Sioran Holdings security gate. She tried it twice. The reader gave a small red light both times. She stepped to the side out of the flow of foot traffic and took out her phone to call Jong-hyun. Jong-hyun answered and told her, in the careful tone of a man who had been told specifically what to say, that there had been a routine security credential rotation and that her updated access would be ready within 24 hours and that she should work remotely for the remainder of the day. She said, of course, and thanked him and ended the call. She stood on the sidewalk outside this building for a moment. Around her, people moved with the ordinary, purposeful indifference of Midtown at midday. Cabs. Delivery cyclists. A woman walking 3 dogs of different sizes in imperfect coordination. Yuna was a careful person. She had been careful for 14 months in a way that most people could not have sustained, and her carefulness had rested on a clear-eyed assessment of risk that she updated continuously. She updated it now, running the variables with the same internal precision she'd been using since this began. Routine credential rotation, plausible, happened occasionally. Jong-hyun's tone had been managed, not alarmed, but managed. The distinction was important. She called Day Sick. He picked up on the first ring. My access is suspended, she said, keeping her voice level, standing still on the sidewalk because moving while anxious made her look like what she was. The pause on his end was a half-second too long. I heard, he said. Her stomach dropped. When? An hour ago. Min-kyu has been building a file. Another pause. Longer than we thought. The sidewalk continued its ordinary business around her. A woman pushed a stroller past. A food truck down the block was doing steady lunch business. Everything was exactly the same as it had been 30 seconds ago, and none of it came at all. How much does he have? She asked. Enough. Define enough. Enough that if Tae-jin wanted to move on us legally, he could begin the filing. He hasn't yet, which means he wants to know who else, she said. He wants the full picture before he closes the door. Yes. She turned and started walking. Not toward anything specifically, just the motion of a person who needed to be moving while thinking. Daisik, the accounts. Already moved, not all of them, but the Bayonne documents, the carrier contracts. If he's building a legal case, Yuna. His voice shifted register. Not reassurance, closer to warning. Jong is accelerating the timeline, the meeting tonight. I know about the meeting. If Jong moves on the carrier contracts before Tae-jin can lock them down, none of the rest of it matters. The asset value in play covers everything else. She stopped walking. She was at a crosswalk, light red, a crowd assembled waiting for green. She stood among them and felt the specific cold clarity of someone whose options have just narrowed past a threshold. He knows about us, she said. Yes. Both of us. Together. Yes. Not just the information leak, he knows the relationship. Yuna, answer me. A beat. Yes. Min-kyu built the full picture. The light went green. The crowd moved. She stayed at the curb for a moment and then crossed with the next wave, slower than everyone else. The affair had been instrumental. She had understood from the beginning that proximity to Tae-jin required a specific currency, and she had used it with the cold calculation of someone who had decided that the end was worth the means. She had not anticipated feeling anything, and she had been correct about that. What she'd felt for Tae-jin was not affection, but something closer to professional respect, the appreciation of a skilled practitioner for another skilled practitioner, and she had maintained the separation between that and her actual purpose with almost perfect discipline. Almost. The night she'd stayed in the kitchen. That had been a judgment call, and standing on the sidewalk in Midtown now, she was reassessing it with the full benefit of hindsight. She had calculated that Nia Calloway finding her would accelerate the personal disruption, create the distraction window the Bayonne operation needed. She had been correct about the effect. What she had underestimated was Nia herself, the speed with which the woman had reassembled, the way her departure had clarified rather than clouded Tae-jin's attention, the viral video and what it had done to the public profile of a woman who had been invisible. Nia's reemergence had made Tae-jin's anger about the affair cleaner, more directed, less paralyzing. That was the miscalculation. She called a car. While she waited, she texted a number that was not Day6 and not connected to anything in her current phone's contact list, a number she had memorized rather than saved. The text was 4 words. We need to talk. The response came back in 90 seconds. Tonight, same place. She got in the car when it arrived and gave an address in Long Island City and sat in the back seat while Manhattan moved past the window and understood with complete and unsentimental clarity that the next 72 hours would determine whether 14 months of careful, costly, precise work resulted in anything except her own exposure. And that the man she had underestimated, not Tae-jin, but the woman who had walked out of his house with a single suitcase and rebuilt herself in less than 2 months, had shifted the entire architecture of the situation in a way that nobody had planned for. The car moved through traffic. Yuna looked at her own reflection in the window, the city passing through it, and for the first time in 14 months felt the specific discomfort of a person whose plan has met a variable they did not model. The meeting with Park Jin-ho happened on a Thursday at 6 in the morning, before the Port Authority offices opened, in a diner in Bayonne that smelled like fryer oil and old coffee and the specific exhaustion of men who worked before dawn. Jin-ho was 52 years old and had the body of someone who had spent 30 years moving between desk work and physical labor, wide through the shoulders, thick hands wrapped around a mug, eyes that assessed and recalculated constantly in the way of a man who had learned to read rooms early and had kept the habit. He had worked the Bayonne port operations for 19 years. He knew exactly what he was, which was the only honest thing about him. Tae-jin came alone. No Min-kyu, no Marcus, no one in the parking lot outside. He'd driven himself in a car nobody connected to Sioran Holdings, and he sat across from Jin-ho in a corner booth with his jacket on, and his hands flat on the table and let the silence of the empty diner do its work for the first 30 seconds. Jin-ho looked at the hands, then at the face, then he picked up his coffee and drank. "I figured you'd send someone," Jin-ho said. "I don't send people for conversations I want to have myself." "That's one way to do it," Jin-ho set the mug down. "How much do you know?" "Enough that I don't need to be here," Tae-jin said. "I'm here because you haven't moved yet. That tells me you're still deciding." Jin-ho's jaw worked slightly. Not nerves, calculation, visible on the surface of a man who wasn't built for concealment. "Daesik called me last night, after the Jong meeting." "I know." "You know what Jong offered?" "I know what Jong needs," Tae-jin said. "The carrier contracts lock in 6 weeks. If they can displace Seoran's position in the Bayonne operations before that window closes, they control the Eastern distribution channel for the next 4 years. What they offered you is a piece of whatever they carve out." Jin-ho looked at the table. "The question," Tae-jin continued, "is whether you believe they can deliver it, because what they're offering you requires Seoran to fall back from Bayonne first, and that requires me to be looking somewhere else." He paused. "I'm not looking somewhere else." "I can see that. So here's what I'm offering you." Tae-jin leaned forward slightly. Not threatening. The way a man leans when he wants to make sure the other person understands this is between them specifically. "You give me the full picture of what was communicated to you, including what Daesik told you about the timeline and what Jong's people offered specifically. In exchange, what you've done up to this point stays between us. Your position at the Port Authority stays intact. Your pension stays intact." He held Jin-ho's gaze. "What happens to you after that depends entirely on what you decide to do next." Jin-ho was quiet for a moment. A cook appeared briefly in the window behind the counter and disappeared again. Somewhere in the kitchen, something hit a metal surface and clattered. "You can't promise me that," Jin-ho said. "You can promise it today. What about when the legal side of this plays out?" "I'm not interested in you," Tae-jin said flatly. "You're a mechanism. I want the people who built the mechanism." Jin-ho looked at him for a long moment with the specific expression of a man measuring the distance between two bad options and trying to determine which one has a softer landing. Then he picked up his coffee again, and he started talking. "What?" Tae-jin sat in his car in the diner parking lot for 20 minutes after Jin-ho left, with his phone in his hand and the information settling into the full picture it made. The Jeong network had been moving on Bayonne for 8 months. The carrier contract displacement was the objective, but the method had evolved. Originally, it had been a purely financial play, an attempt to undercut Seoran's position through competitive bidding on the next cycle. When that approach proved too slow, Jong Seung-won had found Daesik, or Daesik had found Jong. Jin-ho wasn't certain of the originating direction, and the strategy had shifted. Internal sabotage. Document leaks that would compromise Seoran's negotiating position, a manufactured personal crisis for the organization's leader. And at the center of the personal crisis, a woman who had been placed with devastating precision. Tae-jin called Min-kyu. "Move on the accounts," he said. "All of them. Everything we identified. Full freeze, legal filing by end of day. Daesik will know immediately." "Yes." "If he goes to ground," "He won't. He'll go to Jong." Tae-jin started the car. "Which is what I want. Set up the contact with the federal task force. I want the meeting tonight." Silence on Min-kyu's end for a moment. The federal contact was a last resort, a relationship Tae-jin had maintained carefully for years, a boundary between his legitimate and illegitimate operations that he had treated as inviolable precisely because the moment it was used, it changed the nature of his organization permanently. Bringing in federal interest on Jong meant inviting scrutiny that could not be controlled, attention that would not stay where it was pointed. "You understand what that opens up," Min-kyu said. "I understand." He pulled out of the parking lot. "Make the call." Pote. The Morrison Theater in Manhattan held 1,100 seats and had sold every one of them for Nia Calloway's concert in 4 days. Nia did not know this was remarkable until Celeste told her, and when Celeste told her, she'd sat very still for a moment and then asked how many of the ticket buyers had come from the video. "Most of them initially," Celeste said, "but it spread from there. People who know music, Nia. People who've been to serious concerts. The video got them in the door, and then they listened to the recordings Raymond made in his studio, and they bought tickets. The studio recordings aren't finished. He released 3 of them as previews. Did he not tell you? He had told her. She had been in the middle of a rehearsal session when he called, and she had listened and said yes, and then gone back to the piano and not fully absorbed the information until now, standing in the conservatory hallway with Celeste looking at her with the particular patience of a woman who had spent decades watching people encounter their own significance at inconvenient moments. 1,100 people, Nia said. 1,100 people, Celeste confirmed. Nia looked at the rehearsal hall door. Through it, the piano waited. I need to go practice, she said. Nia. She stopped. Are you ready for this? Celeste asked. Not the concert, the everything. Nia thought about it honestly, the way she had been trying to think about things since Brooklyn, without managing the answer into a shape that was easier to carry. No, she said, but I'm going anyway. Celeste said, that's the whole answer right there. Kwan Day-sik found out about the account freeze at 2:17 in the afternoon when his financial operations manager called him from a parking garage in Newark because he didn't trust indoor spaces that week. Day-sik was in his car on the New Jersey Turnpike, heading toward a meeting he had already decided might be his last useful movement before everything became visible. And he took the call on Bluetooth with both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road, and the particular steadiness of a man who has been in difficult positions before and survived them through forward momentum rather than stopping to assess. How much, he said. All primary accounts. The secondary channel is still accessible, but they'll find it within the day if they're looking. Move whatever's in the secondary channel into the blind structure. There's not enough time to do what you can. He ended the call. He thought about Yuna. Her text 2 nights ago, the Long Island City meeting, what she'd told him about the internal access suspension, her assessment of the damage. She was precise. She had been precise throughout. Her assessment had been that they had a narrow window and that the window was closing and that the only move that preserved anything was acceleration. Jong had agreed to accelerate, but Jong's acceleration required Bayon to be operationally compromised before the legal filing landed, and the filing had landed 6 hours ahead of schedule, which meant someone had talked. Jin-ho. Day-sik felt the knowledge of it settle in his stomach with the cold weight of a confirmed answer to a question he'd been hoping not to have to ask. He called Jong Seung-won's direct number. Jong picked up on the 3rd ring. I heard. Jin-ho went to him, Day-sik said. Yes. What's the adjusted timeline? A pause that told Day-sik everything about the adjusted timeline before Jong said a word. The carrier contracts are locked until we can establish operational disruption. With the legal filing in place, we can't touch the Bayonne contracts without triggering federal review. Federal. The word sat differently in the car. He brought in the task force. It appears so. Day-sik was quiet for a moment. Outside the car, the turnpike stretched flat and gray in both directions, industrial New Jersey doing what it always did, existing without apology, enormous and indifferent. He's done, Day-sik said, not referring to himself. His exposure is significant, Jong said carefully. I'm not talking about exposure. I'm talking about the decision to bring in federal attention on his own operations. Day-sik tightened his hands on the wheel. A man who does that is dismantling himself. He's decided the organization isn't worth protecting at the cost of what it costs. Silence on Jong's end. Which means he's going to finish this clean, Day-sik continued. And whatever's left of me on the other side of it is going to be whatever I manage to move in the next 48 hours. Day-sik, I need the transport arrangement confirmed. That's not something I can do in 48, then in 72. I need the arrangement confirmed. His voice was level, flat. The voice of a man who has decided that the time for strategy has passed, and what remains is pure mechanics. You owe me that much. What I gave you bought Jong 4 years of positioning. I delivered what I promised. Deliver what you promised. Another pause. Longer. I'll make the call, Jong said. Day-sik ended the call. He drove. Us. Tae-jin met with the federal contact at 9 that evening, in a building in Lower Manhattan that was not a government building and held no identifying information on its exterior. The contact was a woman named Sandra Cho, who was 47 and had spent the last 11 years working organized crime financing cases, and who had the specific manner of someone who had sat across tables from powerful men for long enough that the power no longer registered as anything except data. She looked at the documentation Min-kyu had prepared and asked 3 questions and then sat back. "This implicates your port operations directly," she said. "I'm aware." "Cooperation on the Zhong network, Hwan Dae-sik, in exchange for defined treatment of the Sioran Holdings exposure." She looked at him. "What specifically are you offering?" "Full documentation of the conspiracy, financial records, communication records, the Jinho conversation recorded with his knowledge and agreement." Tae-jin looked at her steadily. "Testimony regarding the operational structure of the Zhong network's Eastern distribution interference, if the case requires it. And in exchange, defined scope. What's on the table stays on the table. What's not on the table doesn't get opened by this investigation." Sandra Cho looked at him with the expression of a woman calibrating. "You understand I can't make promises about scope. I understand you can make recommendations that carry significant weight." She picked up one of the documents, set it down. "Why now?" "Because the alternative is a war that damages the port operations, the carrier contracts, and several legitimate businesses that employ a substantial number of people, and I have decided I'm not interested in fighting that war." She looked at him. "That's not the whole answer." Tae-jin said nothing. "A man in your position doesn't make this decision because of carrier contracts," she said. "What changed?" The question sat in the room. Tae-jin thought about Nia's hands on the piano. He thought about Min-kyu saying, "You're not sleeping." He thought about Hyeran pressing a single key on the music room piano and letting the note decay. "I got tired," he said. Sandra Cho looked at him for a moment longer and then picked up her pen. "Otak." The night before the concert, Nia could not sleep. She lay in the guest room of Imani's apartment and stared at the ceiling at 3 in the morning and listened to the radiator and tried to locate the source of what she was feeling, because it was not stage fright exactly. She had performed enough times before Tae-jin to know what stage fright felt like, and this was not it. Stage fright was about the audience. This was about herself. She was going to walk onto a stage in Manhattan tomorrow evening and play music she had written during the worst year of her life. Not the year of leaving, though that was in there, but the years before it. The years of disappearing by degrees, the years of making herself smaller in rooms where she had every right to take up space. She had put all of that into the music because it was the only place she'd been able to put it, and now 1,100 strangers were going to sit in the dark and listen to it, and she had no control over what it would do to them. She sat up. She went to the living room and sat at Imani's upright in the dark without turning on a light, and placed her hands on the keys without playing. The keys were cool under her palms. She sat there for a long time, just holding the contact between her hands and the instrument, feeling her own heartbeat slow to something manageable, feeling the silence of the apartment arrange itself around her. Then she played the opening of the piece she'd be performing first tomorrow. Slowly, quietly, barely pressing the keys, more suggestion than sound, so she wouldn't wake Imani. It was there. Everything she'd put into it was still there. She played it through once, almost silently, in the dark, for nobody. Then she went back to bed and slept. Dae-sik made 3 mistakes in the final 48 hours, and each of them came from speed. The first was moving money through a channel that Min-kyu had already flagged and was monitoring in real time. The second was meeting with a Zhong associate in a location that placed him on 3 different cameras. The third was calling Yuna from a number that could be traced, which told Tae-jin's legal team that the 2 of them were still in active communication and gave the federal case a threat it needed. By the morning of the concert, Dae-sik's remaining accessible assets had been legally frozen through the Sioran Holdings claim, confirmed by a federal hold that Sandra Cho's team filed at 7 a.m. Dae-sik was not yet arrested. The case required another 72 hours of documentation. But every financial door available to him had closed in a span of 18 hours. The transport arrangement Zhong had promised did not materialize. Dae-sik sat in a hotel room in Jersey City that he'd paid cash for, and he looked at his phone, and he understood that the mobility he had counted on was gone. Not dramatically, not with a confrontation or a moment of reckoning. It had simply stopped being available, the way an exit closes when a building settles, without announcement. He was not a stupid man. He had known this was a possible outcome. He had constructed the plan to avoid it, and the plan had failed at the specific point where he had relied on someone else to hold up their end, which was a mistake he had made before, and had always promised himself he would stop making. He called his lawyer. Tae-jin stood in his dressing room, not a dressing room, a coat closet in the Morrison Theater's upper lobby that a staff member had let him use when he'd arrived 3 hours before the concert started, because he needed somewhere to be that wasn't a seat and wasn't the street. And he stood with his jacket on and his hands in his pockets and stared at the wall. He had bought a single ticket, back row, stage right, behind a pillar that would keep him in shadow for most of the performance. He had not told anyone except Min-kyu where he was going tonight, not Hyeran, not Jong-hyun, not any of the men who moved through his days as extensions of his operational life. He was here as a man, just that. After 45 years of being everything else that had accumulated around the man, he was in this building as just that, with nothing to protect and nothing to negotiate and no leverage in any direction. The lobby outside the closet door had filled steadily over the last hour. He could hear it, the sound of 1,100 people assembling, the particular frequency of an audience that has come somewhere expecting to feel something and is already in the anticipatory state before it happens. His phone buzzed. Min-kyu. DASIC retained counsel. Federal hold confirmed. Package is complete. He put the phone in his pocket. Another buzz. Min-kyu again. Yuna's access removed from all remaining systems. Legal team will contact her this week. He put the phone away again. He thought about writing Nia a message. He had thought about it for 3 days, and each time had stopped himself because there was nothing to say in a text that wouldn't be the wrong thing, and because the right thing, if there was a right thing, was something that required him to be a person rather than a sender of messages. He left the coat closet at 7:55, 5 minutes before the house lights dimmed, and found his way to his seat in the back row behind the pillar. The theater was full. He had been in rooms with more people. He had been in rooms with more power, more money, more danger. He had sat at tables where the decisions made would affect the movement of significant financial weight across multiple jurisdictions. He had never felt as exposed as he did right now, in the dark, behind a pillar, waiting. The house lights went down, the stage light came up, and Nia Calloway walked out. She was wearing a midnight blue dress that was simple enough to look like she hadn't thought about it, and precise enough to make clear she had. Her hair was up. She wore the gold bracelet, her grandmother's, the one she'd taken from the velvet tray the night she left. No other jewelry. She walked to the piano and she adjusted the bench slightly. The same small adjustment she had always made. The same angle, the specific habit of a body that knows exactly what it needs. And she sat down. She did not look at the audience. She placed her hands on the keys. And she played. What? The first piece was the composition she'd started 12 years ago and finished in the last 3 months, and Tae-jin recognized it from the video. But hearing it live was different in the way that everything is different when the glass between you and the real thing is removed. In the theater, with the sound filling the space from a concert grand rather than an upright in a borrowed room, with Nia's entire body part of the instrument in the way a pianist's body becomes. When the separation between the player and the played dissolves, it was almost too much to sit with. He sat with it. He sat with the second piece, which was newer, sharper, something built from faster material, the kind of compositional anger that doesn't announce itself as anger but moves like it through a room, and the audience felt it. He could feel them feeling it in the collective quality of their stillness. He sat with the third, which was slower. Grief-shaped. The kind of music that doesn't perform sadness but simply inhabits it, and doesn't ask your permission to enter you through the ear and rearrange things. At some point, Tae-jin realized his hands were gripping his knees, and he made himself release them, lay his palms flat on his legs, and breathe at the pace the music set. The fourth piece was the one that ended him. He did not know its name. He would not learn until afterward that she'd titled it simply The Knot, and that she had written it in a single sitting at 4 in the morning in Amani's apartment 6 days after she left. It began with a simple motif, 2 notes, repeating patient, the kind of patience that is not peace but endurance. And then it opened outward into something that contained every texture he had heard in the previous 3 pieces and layered them simultaneously. The anger under the grief, under the joy of a woman who had found her own voice and was using it without apology in front of 1,100 people in the dark. Tae-jin did not cry. He was not a man who cried. and he was not going to perform feeling in a way that had nothing to do with Nia and everything to do with his own need to process himself. He sat still. He kept his hands flat on his knees. He breathed. But something in his chest, behind the sternum, in the specific place where a person keeps the understanding of what they have done and cannot undo. That place opened and stayed open, and he let it. When the fourth piece ended, the audience held its silence for a full 3 seconds before the applause came. Tae-jin did not move. The audience was on its feet. He sat in the dark behind his pillar and watched Nia stand from the bench and face 1,100 people who had just heard the most private year of her life and understood it completely. And he watched her face in the stage light. Not triumphant, not relieved, not performing for the moment. Something quieter than any of those. Something that was simply, completely hers. He sat through the second half of the concert in the same stillness. He sat through the standing ovation at the end, which lasted 4 minutes and brought Nia back to the stage 3 times. When the house lights came up and people began moving toward the exits, Tae-jin sat for another minute. The man next to him, a white-haired man in his late 60s who had cried openly through the third piece and seemed unbothered by the evidence of it, gathered his coat and program and said to no one in particular, "I don't know where she's been all this time, but wherever it was, it made her." He left. Tae-jin sat alone in his row, then he stood up. He made his way through the thinning crowd to the lobby and through a side corridor to the artist exit area, a concrete hallway behind the stage where the temperature dropped by 10 degrees and the sound of the city returned through a propped exterior door. He stood near the wall and waited. He had not planned what to say. He had no plan at all. That was the most frightening thing he had done in years. 20 minutes after the house lights came up, the artist exit door opened and a group of 3 came through first. 2 women from the conservatory. Tae-jin recognized Celeste from photographs, and a younger man with a camera bag. They went past him without registering his presence. Then Nia came through the door. She was still in the midnight blue dress, a light coat over it now, her hair still up, and she was talking to someone just behind her when she came through. And then she stopped talking, and she stopped moving because she had looked up and seen him. The person behind her, a man Tae-jin didn't recognize, almost walked into her, and then registered the quality of her stillness, and stopped too, and looked between them, and quietly stepped back inside the door and let it close. The hallway was empty except for the 2 of them. Tae-jin's hands were at his sides. He had thought about this moment for 2 months, and had imagined many versions of it, and none of them had included the specific quality of what he felt right now, which was not the confidence of a man with a plan, and not the desperation of a man without one, but something much simpler and much harder to carry. He was afraid she would look at him the way she'd looked at him the night she left. Not angry, not broken, but clear-eyed and final in the way of someone who has already traveled past the point where your presence means something specific to them. She looked at him. She did not look at him that way. What was in her face was more complicated than that, more human. She was tired and present, and she had just played 4 hours of music that contained the most honest year of her life. And she was still in whatever space that takes a performer into. And she was looking at him not as the man who had wronged her, and not as the man she had married, but as someone she knew completely, in all the ways that knowing someone over 9 years creates, with all of that knowledge present at once, unfiltered. Tae-jin said, "Your music is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard." The hallway held the words. Nia looked at him. She did not move toward him. She did not move away. "I know you were there," she said quietly. "Celeste told me someone bought a single back row ticket 3 weeks ago." A pause. "I knew it was you." He said nothing. "Why didn't you sit somewhere I could see you?" "Because I wasn't there for you to see," he said. "I was there to listen." Something shifted in her face at that. He couldn't have named it with precision. It was the face of a woman filing information away in a category she hasn't decided the label for yet. Tae-jin. She said his name carefully. Not a weapon, not a softness. Just a name, and all that it contained. I've spent 2 months becoming something I almost lost. I don't know yet what I'm becoming, exactly. But I know what it cost to get here, and I'm not going to protect what you destroyed. I'm going to protect this. She touched the coat over her chest, not dramatically, just indicated the center of herself. "Whatever this is now." "I know," he said. "Do you?" "Yes." He held her gaze. "I know. I'm not here to ask for it back." Then what are you here for? The question sat between them in the concrete corridor with the sound of the city coming through the propped door and the backstage lights, making everything slightly too stark and real. Tae-jin thought about the right answer and discarded it because the right answer was constructed, and what she had just done on that stage for 4 hours was the opposite of constructed, and anything he said that was less honest than what she had just played would be another way of failing her. I wanted you to know that I heard it, he said. All of it. I wanted you to know that someone who should have been listening for 9 years was finally in the room. Nia looked at him for a long moment. The propped door let in cold air. Somewhere above them, the theater was emptying, 1,100 people dispersing into the Manhattan night carrying whatever the music had put into them. And in this hallway, the two of them stood in the specific silence that exists between people who have a shared history long enough and complicated enough that no single moment can resolve it. Go home, Tae-jin, she said finally. Not cruelly. With something that was almost the beginning of something. He nodded once. He turned and walked toward the exit. He did not look back. And Nia stood in the concrete corridor and watched him go, and felt the complicated, unresolved, entirely honest weight of a woman who has not forgiven someone and has not forgotten them, and is not sure yet what the space between those two things is going to become. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. Raymond. Standing ovation 3 times. The label wants to talk about the full release timeline. Call me tomorrow. She put the phone away. She pushed through the artist exit door into the Manhattan night. The city hit her. Sound and cold and the smell of exhaust in October and the particular aliveness of 11 p.m. in a city that does not stop. And she stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the slice of sky between the buildings and breathed it in. Behind her, somewhere in the crowd still dispersing from the main entrance around the corner, Tae-jin was walking away from the most honest thing he had ever done. Ahead of her, the city opened in every direction. Nia Calloway pulled her coat tighter and began to walk. The walk home took 40 minutes. Nia did not take a car. She walked from the Morrison Theater through Midtown and down into the West Side, cutting through blocks she didn't usually use, past bodegas and late restaurants and the specific population of Manhattan at 11 p.m. on a weeknight. The people who work nights, the people who can't sleep, the people who have just come from something and haven't yet returned to who they were before it. She walked with her hands in her coat pockets and her grandmother's bracelet cool against her wrist, and the city doing what it always did, which was to be completely indifferent to whatever a person was carrying. She thought about Tae-jin's face in the corridor. Not the face she'd expected. She had prepared for the face of a man with a strategy. Because Tae-jin always had a strategy. It was the thing she had loved early and resented later. The constant sense of being in a room with someone who was always 3 moves ahead. She had prepared for the careful language of a man who wanted something and had constructed an approach to getting it. What she had seen instead was a man standing in a cold hallway with his hands at his sides, and nothing in his face except the specific exhaustion of someone who has run out of the energy required to be anything other than honest. She did not know what to do with that. She walked. By the time she got back to Carroll Gardens, the streets were quiet and her feet hurt from the concert shoes and the bracelet had warmed to her skin. She let herself into the building and climbed the stairs and found Imani sitting on the couch in the dark with the television on mute, which was Imani's specific version of waiting up without making a performance of it. Imani looked at her face. He was there. Yes. Did he say anything? He said my music was the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard. Nia sat on the far end of the couch and took her shoes off and set them by the coffee table. He said he was sorry. Not in those words. In the way where you know the person means it because they don't dress it up. Imani was quiet for a moment. What did you say? I told him to go home. Nia leaned her head back against the couch and looked at the ceiling. And then I stood in an empty hallway and didn't know what I felt. What do you feel now? Nia thought about it honestly, the way she'd been trying to think about everything, like a person who has been through something real and isn't done being through it yet. She looked at Imani. I don't want to forgive him tonight. I don't think I can, and I don't think I should try. Nobody's asking you to. He might be. Eventually. Eventually isn't tonight, Imani said. Nia was quiet. The television showed a weather map, someone pointing at systems moving across the country. Somewhere out there, the October weather was doing what it was doing, indifferent to everything beneath it. The music worked, Nia said finally. Yeah. I played it and it worked, and I was there for all of it, and I didn't disappear. She turned her head to look at Imani. I used to disappear on stage. Not visibly, but inside. I'd be playing and part of me would leave because I couldn't hold the feeling and perform at the same time. I remember, Imani said quietly. Tonight I stayed. The whole time. She looked at her hands in her lap. I don't know when that changed. I know when, Imani said. It was about 6 weeks ago when you played that same piano at 4 a.m. in the dark and didn't know I was awake. Nia looked at her. I heard you through the door, Imani said. I sat in the hallway for 40 minutes because I didn't want to interrupt it. A pause. That was when it changed. You just weren't watching. Kwande-sik was arrested on a Friday morning outside a diner in Hoboken, which was not where he had planned to be, and was the result of a sequence of decisions that each made sense individually and together formed the portrait of a man who had run out of room to move. His lawyer was present within the hour, which was the one thing that went according to plan. The federal charges were substantial. The civil claims from Sioran Holdings were separate and would take considerably longer to resolve. Tae-jin sat in a holding room and looked at the table and thought about the 11 years he had spent inside Tae-jin's organization, the patience of it, the slow construction of a position that had eventually given him the access and the leverage he had decided to use against the man who had trusted him with it. He thought about what he had wanted. Not the money specifically. The money was a mechanism. What he had wanted was the bionic position itself, the operational control, the thing that would have made him not a lieutenant but a principal. A man with his own standing rather than a reflected one. He had not gotten it. He sat at the table and looked at his own hands. His lawyer was talking about cooperation frameworks and discovery timelines, and Tae-jin listened with the part of his mind that processed legal language and let the rest of it settle into the particular quiet of a man who has reached the end of a road and is waiting for the dust to clear enough to see where he actually is. Yuna's lawyer called Tae-jin's lawyer 2 days after the arrest. The call lasted 14 minutes. By the end of it, the contours of what had happened between them had been outlined for the record in terms that were legally precise and personally devastating, and Tae-jin understood that the relationship, constructed from mutual utility and maintained by mutual need, had concluded with the same cold efficiency with which it had been built. He had known that was the nature of it. Knowing the nature of a thing does not always make the confirmation of it easy or sad. Yuna met with her lawyer on a Saturday morning in an office in Murray Hill, and she sat across the desk from a woman named Patricia, who had handled sensitive employment and civil cases for 20 years, and who looked at the Sioran Holdings documentation with the expression of someone calculating exposure. They can establish the access pattern conclusively, Patricia said. I know. The financial routing takes more work to trace, but it's traceable. I know. The affair... Patricia paused. In civil terms, the affair is less central than the information leak, but it establishes the proximity that made the access possible. They'll use it for the narrative. Yuna sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the desk. She was wearing clothes she had owned before this job, before this year, before all of it. A gray sweater and dark trousers that belonged to the person she'd been when she first made the decision to pursue this particular operation. She had dressed that way deliberately this morning, not nostalgically, but as a kind of accounting. Here is what I was when I decided. Here is what I am now. What's the realistic exposure? She said. Patricia told her. Yuna absorbed it without visible reaction. She had always been able to absorb hard numbers without visible reaction. It was one of her more useful qualities, and also, she had come to understand, one of the things that made other people find her unsettling without being able to identify why. The thing I keep coming back to, Yuna said, is the calculation I made about Nia Calloway. Patricia looked at her. I assessed her as a peripheral factor, a woman in a difficult marriage who would absorb a personal blow and become an additional weight on him, a destabilizing element. She paused. She was not that. People generally aren't what they look like from a distance, Patricia said. I know that. I knew that. I made the assessment anyway because it was the convenient assessment. She looked at the window. She walked out of that house and rebuilt herself in 8 weeks. 8 weeks. The video, the concert, the recording contract. She stopped. I handed her an exit she might not have taken otherwise, and she used it to become something she'd been trying to become for a decade. Patricia watched her. Is this relevant to your case? No, Yuna said. It's just something I'm going to have to know about myself. Yeren called Tae-jin on a Sunday morning and told him to come for dinner the following weekend, and it was not an invitation. He came. She lived in a brownstone in Flushing that she had occupied for 30 years and refused to leave despite the offers Tae-jin had made over the years to move her somewhere larger, somewhere with staff, somewhere easier. She cooked herself. She had a small garden in the back that she maintained with the same precision she brought to everything else, and the house smelled of ginger and sesame and the specific accumulated scent of a life lived in one place long enough for the building to absorb it. Tae-jin arrived at 6 with wine she wouldn't drink, and the particular posture of a man going somewhere he knows will be difficult and has decided to be present for anyway. Yeran put food on the table without ceremony. They ate. She asked him about the Bayonne situation in the precise terms of someone who had spent decades understanding the family's operations without ever participating in them directly, and he told her the truth in the same terms because she had always known when he was managing her, and she had never forgiven it. When the dishes were cleared and the tea was on the table, she said, "Tell me about the concert." He looked at his tea. "She was extraordinary." "That's not what I asked." He looked up. "Tell me what happened when you were sitting in that theater," Hieron said. Not unkindly. With the directness of a woman who has spent 69 years learning that the time saved by getting to the point is worth the discomfort of arriving there. Tae-jin thought about how to describe it, and then stopped trying to construct a description and just said it plainly. "I understood what I destroyed, not what I lost, what I destroyed. There's a difference." Hieron looked at him. "Loss implies something that happened to me," he said. "What actually happened was something I did. To her, first, and then to myself." He wrapped his hands around the tea mug. She played 4 hours of music that she'd been carrying inside her for years, and none of it would exist in the form it exists now if I hadn't... He stopped, reorganized. "She's better than she was before me. Not because of me, despite me. Because of what she found in herself when there was nothing left to manage." Hieran was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" she said. "I'm going to write her a letter," he said. "By hand. Not a message. A letter." He looked at his tea. "And then I'm going to do what I should have done years ago, which is stop building things that require me to be a specific kind of person to maintain them. The organization. The parts of it that taught me control was the same thing as strength." He looked at her. "I'm not the same person who inherited what I inherited. I've been running something I didn't build because it was there and because dismantling it seemed like weakness. It isn't weakness. It's the only honest thing left to do with it." Hieran looked at her son for a long moment. She looked at his hands, which were his father's hands, large and capable, and currently wrapped around a ceramic mug in his mother's kitchen on a Sunday night with nothing to negotiate and nowhere to be except here. "Your father," she said, "would have disagreed with you." "I know." "I don't," she said. He looked at her. "I never agreed with what it required of him. I accepted it because that was the life I entered, but I never agreed." She picked up her own tea. "I'm glad you're disagreeing with it now, even if it took this much to get you there." The letter took Tae-jin 3 nights to write, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he kept writing the wrong version, the version that contained too much self-defense, or the version that was so stripped of self that it read like a legal document, or the version that ended with something that sounded like a question even when he tried to make it a statement. He wrote it by hand, which he had not done for anything personal in years, and his handwriting was worse than he remembered, cramped in places and too large in others, the handwriting of a man who spent his days signing documents rather than composing them. On the 3rd night, he wrote a version that was true. He wrote about the dinner when she had told him she was thinking of going back to performing, and he had said, "Let's talk about it after Seoul." And Seoul had been followed by Tokyo and Tokyo by the restructuring, and the restructuring by everything else, and they had never talked about it. He wrote about the night she had played downstairs while he was in his office, and he had heard it through the floor and had not gone down, not because he was busy. He remembered this specifically. He had not been on a call. He had been reading a report that could have waited. but because going down required acknowledging that something was happening, and he had chosen not to acknowledge it. He wrote about the precise moment at their 4th anniversary dinner when she had said something funny and sharp about one of his business associates. And the table had laughed, and he had looked at her with the specific pleasure of a man who is proud of his wife, and how that pride had been entirely about him, about having someone like her, about what it said about him, and not at all about her. He wrote, "I made you into something that reflected well on me, and then I was surprised when the reflection didn't love me the way a person loves." He wrote, "You were a person the entire time. I knew it, and I treated you like a position I'd won." He wrote, "The affair was mine. The choice was mine. Yuna's intentions don't change that. I want to be clear with you about that because I think you deserve to hear me say that it was mine." He wrote, "I don't know what you're becoming, but I watched you play for 4 hours in a theater full of strangers who understood you immediately, and I want you to know that the man who should have been listening for 9 years was finally in the room. It was late. It wasn't enough. It was the honest thing I had left to give you." He did not write "I love you" because it was true, and it was also beside the point, and she was too intelligent, and he had been too dishonest for him to use that true thing as a closing argument. He wrote, "You owe me nothing. I'm not sending this because I expect anything from you. I'm sending it because you spent 9 years next to a man who didn't tell you the truth about what he was doing, and you deserve at least one letter where he does." He sealed it. He drove to Brooklyn the next morning and stood at the door of the Carroll Gardens building and rang the buzzer for Imani Pierce's apartment. Imani's voice came through the intercom with the specific flatness of a woman who was going to need a reason. "I have a letter for Nia," he said. "I'm not asking to come up. I'm not asking anything. I just want to give it to her." A long pause. "Wait there," Imani said. He waited on the sidewalk. It was a cold morning, clear, the kind of November light that makes every surface look slightly too real. Across the street, a man was walking a dog that had stopped to investigate a crack in the pavement with complete commitment. A woman came out of the building next door with a coffee and looked at Tae-jin once and looked away with the practiced indifference of someone who has lived in New York long enough to have stopped registering the presence of large men in good coats standing on sidewalks, looking like they're waiting for something important. The door opened. Nia came out. She was not dressed for anything. She was in jeans and a wool sweater and the same flat shoes she apparently wore for mornings in Brooklyn. And her hair was down and she looked, for the first time in the years Tae-jin had known her, completely like herself. Not the herself she had been at his functions and his dinners and his carefully arranged social events, but the self that existed prior to all of that and had apparently survived it intact. She looked at the envelope in his hand. He held it out. She took it, looked at it. His handwriting on the front. Just her name, Nia, not Mrs. Seo, not her full name, just the first one, in his cramped and imperfect handwriting. "No bodyguards," she said. "No." "You drove yourself?" "Yes." She looked at him. Something moved in her face that was not quite readable. "Are you all right?" The question surprised him. He had not expected her to ask it, not because she was incapable of it, but because he had not constructed a version of this encounter where she was the one asking after him. "I'm managing," he said, which was honest. "The Bayonne situation. Resolved enough. It'll take time to close completely." She nodded. She turned the envelope over in her hands. "You didn't need to do this in person." "No," he agreed. "Why did you?" He thought about the honest answer, because putting it in the mail felt like I was making it easy on myself. She looked at him for a moment, then she looked at the envelope again. "I'm not going to read it in front of you. I didn't expect you to. I'm not going to call you after I read it. I understand. I might not respond at all. I don't know yet. That's yours to decide." She held the envelope at her side and looked at him in the November light with the specific quality of attention she had always brought to the things she was trying to understand fully before she moved. He had seen her look at music that way, at students who were struggling with something, at problems that required her to see them from the right angle before they resolved. She was looking at him that way now. "You look tired," she said. "I haven't been sleeping well." "You never sleep well when something isn't resolved." "No." "Is it resolved now?" He thought about that question honestly, which was the only way he was going to try to answer anything for a while. "The external things are moving toward resolution. The other thing, he paused, I don't think resolution is the right word for it. I think the right word is something more like reckoning. And you don't sleep your way through a reckoning. You just stay in it until you've been in it long enough. Nia was quiet for a moment. Go home, Tae-jin, she said again. But it was different from the corridor of the Morrison Theater. That one had been a closing. This one had something in it that was less final. Not open exactly, but not sealed. He nodded. He turned. Tae-jin. He stopped. She was looking at the envelope, not at him. The wedding ring, she said. That was inside the last thing you sent. Through Min-kyu. He had sent it 3 weeks ago. Inside an envelope Min-kyu delivered to Imani's building. Just the ring, no note. He had not been ready for the letter yet. The ring had been its own statement, and he had trusted her to read it correctly. I know, he said. I still have it. He said nothing. He stood on the sidewalk and waited while she decided what she needed to say about that. I don't know what that means yet, she said. I'm not telling you it means anything specific. I'm just telling you that I still have it because I thought you should know. Thank you for telling me, he said. She went back inside. The door closed. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, and then he walked back to his car and sat in it for a few minutes and breathed at the pace that the morning required, which was slow and careful and without shortcuts. Then he drove back to Manhattan. Nia read the letter alone that afternoon, sitting on the floor of Imani's guest room with her back against the bed and her knees pulled up and the pages in her hands. She read it twice. Then she folded it and held it and sat with the weight of it for a long time. She did not call him. She did not cry, which surprised her slightly, and then didn't, because what the letter produced in her was not grief, or not only grief, but something more complicated. The feeling of finally receiving something she had needed for a long time, arriving too late to be used for what it was originally intended for, but arriving nonetheless. The feeling of being witnessed accurately by someone who had looked away for years and had finally turned back and described what they saw. She placed the letter in her composition notebook, between 2 pages she hadn't written on yet. That evening she played piano at Imani's upright for 2 hours. Not the concert pieces. New material. Something she'd been circling around for the last 2 weeks. A composition that kept changing shape every time she came back to it because it hadn't found its own form yet. She played with the patience of a woman who understood that some things take the time they take and cannot be rushed into clarity. And for the first time in the 2 months she'd been in Brooklyn, she felt the guest room and the borrowed piano and the Carroll Gardens address begin to complete their purpose. She was not going to live here forever. She was going to need her own space. She stopped playing and made a note in her phone about talking to Raymond about the recording timeline and whether the advance structure allowed for an apartment in Brooklyn or whether she needed to wait another month. Practical, specific. The kind of thought that belongs to a person building a life rather than surviving one. But 3 months moved through with the particular pace of months that are full of things. Nia signed the recording contract in November. The advance was not what Raymond had first suggested. She had sent the term sheet to a lawyer who negotiated it up by a margin that Raymond described as aggressively reasonable, which she took as a compliment. She recorded the album over 9 weeks at a studio in Red Hook that had the right acoustics and the right light, and an engineer named Theo who understood immediately that his job was to document rather than to produce, and who sat behind the glass with the specific stillness of someone who knows when to disappear into the work. She titled the album The Knot. Raymond tried to talk her out of the title. It's too personal, he said. People will want to know what it means. Good, Nia said. He thought about it. Okay, he said. She found an apartment in Park Slope in December, 2 floors above a bakery, with a room that was large enough for an upright and a window that faced east and let in the morning light at exactly the angle she needed it. She bought a piano, not a grand, not yet, a quality upright that was better than Imani's and filled the room with the specific presence of an instrument that belonged there. She moved in on a Saturday. Imani helped her carry boxes and spent the afternoon arranging the kitchen in a way that made more organizational sense than Nia's system. And Nia let her because Imani's system actually was better, and she had been making herself admit when things were better instead of just familiar. That evening, after Imani left, Nia stood in the center of the living room and looked at the piano against the east wall and the boxes still stacked in the corner and the winter dark coming through the window, and she felt the apartment take her in, the way a space does when it belongs to you and you've finally arrived in it. She played until midnight. Tae-jin sold the Hudson Mansion in January. He moved into a smaller apartment in the West Village. 3 rooms, no gates, no security detail installed in the building, no staff except a cleaning service that came on Thursdays. The decision required a level of practical adjustment that he had not anticipated. He had not been responsible for the operational details of his own household in 16 years, and the first week was marked by the specific humiliation of a powerful man discovering he did not know where his building's recycling was collected or how to work the espresso machine that had come with the furnished apartment. He learned. He restructured Sioran Holdings through January and February with the assistance of 2 outside law firms and an organizational consultant. Hyeran had recommended, a woman who had spent 30 years fixing corporate structures and who treated Tae-jin's operations with the brisk neutrality of someone who was being paid to see clearly rather than politely. The legitimate businesses were separated from the criminal infrastructure with a precision that would have been impossible 2 years ago, when the two had been so thoroughly entangled that pulling them apart would have destroyed both. The criminal network was not destroyed, it was handed off. The operations that could not simply be abandoned were transferred to a structure that Tae-jin no longer controlled or profited from, and the people within it were given the same information Tae-jin had given himself. This is where we are. These are the options. Here's what I'm doing. Some of them left. Some of them stayed. He let both happen without trying to manage it. The federal case against Jong Sung-won moved through the system with the deliberate pace of federal cases. DASIC cooperated on specific points in exchange for specific considerations. The carrier contracts at Bayonne were secured before the cycle locked in through a combination of legal protection and the kind of direct conversation with Port Authority leadership that Tae-jin was good at when he was paying attention. Min-kyu stayed. Tae-jin had told him in January that the restructuring meant the role was changing. Less intelligence, less operational coordination of the old kind, more corporate structure, more legitimate advisory function. Min-kyu had looked at him for a moment and said, "I know what the role is changing to. I'm still here. You should think about whether that's what you want." "I have thought about it," Min-kyu said. "I've been thinking about it for 3 years. I'm still here." Nia's album released in March. The critical response arrived first, measured, careful, the kind of critical language that reaches for new containers when the existing ones don't fit. Reviewers describing the record as something that lived in the intersection of classical composition and emotional autobiography, something that felt simultaneously very old and very new, something that had no obvious peers in the current landscape. Then the listener response arrived, and it was not measured at all. The video had 4 million views. The album had 4 million streams in the first week. By the second week, the number had tripled, and the comment section of every platform hosting it was full of the same kind of language. People describing where they were when they first heard it, what it moved in them, who they thought of, what they had been carrying that the music seemed to have located and named. Nia read the comments sometimes in the morning, sitting at her kitchen table with coffee. Not because she needed the validation, but because the specific quality of what people said gave her information about what the music had done that she couldn't know from inside the making of it. She was curious about it the way a composer should be. Not grateful in the diminishing way of someone who needed to be told they'd done well, but genuinely interested in the mechanism of how something she'd built in private traveled into other people's private spaces and found its equivalent there. Raymond called her one morning in late March. "The Morrison Theater wants to talk about a residency." "How many nights?" "They're thinking 4. I think we can get 6. "What's the timeline?" "Fall, if you want, which gives you the summer to finish the second album, if the second album is where your head is." She looked at her composition notebook spread across the kitchen table. 3 of them, the old ones she'd brought from the suitcase, and 2 new ones started since Brooklyn. "It's where my head is," she said. 6 nights at the Morrison in the fall," he said. "I'll start the conversation." After she hung up, she sat with her coffee and looked at the notebooks and the piano and the morning light coming through the east window, and she thought about a conversation she'd been circling around for 2 months. She picked up her phone. She called Tae-jin. They met at a Korean restaurant in Queens on a Thursday evening. Small, no tablecloths, the kind of place that had been in its location for 20 years and wore that fact comfortably. Tae-jin was already there when she arrived, at a corner table, no one with him. He stood when she came in, the old habit, and she noticed that the suit was different, not because it was less expensive, but because something about the way he wore it was different, as if he was occupying his own body with less management than before. She sat. They ordered without looking at the menu because they had both been here before, years ago, before the mansion and the security detail and the version of their life that required them to be other things. The food came, they ate, and they talked. And what they talked about was 9 years of marriage from a distance that time and honesty had made possible. Tae-jin did not defend himself. She did not prosecute him. They talked about the specific moments, the canceled performances, the gradual disappearance of her music from the life they shared, the night she had stood beside him at his functions and felt like furniture that had been arranged to reflect well on the room. She told him things she had never said directly because the marriage had not been built for that kind of direct speech. He listened without interrupting, which was different from before, when listening had often contained the visible movement of a man calculating his response. He was just listening. "I want to tell you something," he said when she had finished. She looked at him. "I'm not going to ask you to come back," he said. "That's not what this is. I need you to know that before I say the next thing so that the next thing doesn't sound like a step towards something. All right? I'm glad you left." He held her gaze. "Not because it was good for me. It wasn't, or not initially. But because you needed to. You had been trying to leave for years in every way except the physical one, and I kept making it easier to stay than to go. When you finally went," he paused, "you went so completely. You didn't half leave, you didn't negotiate your departure. You took the one bag and you walked out, and within 2 months you had rebuilt something that 9 years with me hadn't touched." He looked at the table. "That's not a thing I did for you. That's a thing you did in the absence of me. But I'm still glad it happened." Nia sat with that for a moment. "I'm glad it happened too," she said. "I wasn't for a while. I was very angry for a while. You had the right to be." "Yes." She picked up her water glass. "I'm not anymore. Not the way I was. I'm still," she considered, "I'm still understanding what the marriage cost me. Some of that cost I won't fully calculate for years. But the anger as a daily thing, the weight of it, that went into the music, I played it out." She set the glass down. "And now it's an album, and 4 million people have heard it, and the Morrison Theater wants to give me 6 nights in the fall." He looked at her. Something moved in his face that was the thing she had seen in the concert corridor. Not strategic, not performed. 6 nights. 6 nights. "That's what you always deserved," he said quietly. She looked at him across the small table in the small restaurant. Not the man she had married, exactly. Or not only that man. The man he had been moving toward for the last several months, through the letter and the sold mansion and the restructuring and the Thursday evenings with no staff and no plans. A man at the beginning of something rather than at the height of it, which was a version of him she had not encountered before. "I'm starting over," she said. "Not from zero. I don't have the option of zero, but from what's actually here. Right now." "So am I," he said. "I know." She reached for her tea. He reached for his. The restaurant continued around them. Other tables, other conversations, the kitchen making its sounds, the street outside doing what streets do. "I'd like to come to the Morrison," he said carefully. "In the fall, if that's all right with you." She thought about it. "Not the back row behind a pillar," she said. "No. If you come, you sit where I can see you." He looked at her steadily. "Understood." They stayed for 2 hours. They talked about his mother, who had told him last week that she was joining a senior community garden project and that he was going to stop worrying about her. They talked about Imani, who had started writing again, short stories, something she'd abandoned in her 20s, and about Gerald, the 63-year-old retired postal worker who had finally, after 4 months of Tuesday evenings, played an entire piece from beginning to end without stopping. They talked about the second album and what it was going to be, and Tae-jin asked questions about the compositional process that were specific and genuine, and Nia answered them with the pleasure of a person whose expertise is being treated as expertise. When they left, they stood on the sidewalk in the Queen's Night for a moment. "I'll walk to the subway," Nia said. "I'll get a cab," he said. They looked at each other. The specific weight of all that had happened and not happened, and was still in the process of becoming something sat between them, and also simply was what it was. Two people at the end of an evening, standing on a sidewalk in Queens, with a long history and an uncertain future and the ordinary cold of a March night. Tae-jin, she said. Yes. I still have the ring. He looked at her. I'm not telling you it means something specific yet, she said. I'm telling you it means something. I don't know what. She put her hands in her coat pockets. I thought you should know. Thank you for telling me, he said. The same words he'd said on the Carroll Gardens sidewalk. She nodded once. She walked to the subway. He stood on the sidewalk and watched her go, not to hold the image of it, but simply because he was there and she was walking and the night was cold and he had nothing to do but be present in it. The following Saturday, Yeran had them both to dinner, not separately. Together, with the specificity of intention that Yeran brought to everything she decided to do. She cooked for 3 hours. She set a table properly. She did not explain herself or make a speech about it. She opened the door when they arrived and looked at them both and said, "Wash your hands, food's ready," and turned back to the kitchen. They ate. After dinner, Yeran led them to the sitting room, and there in the corner, where it had always been, was the old piano she'd owned since before Tae-jin was born. An upright with yellowed keys and a pedal that stuck slightly on the right, and a particular resonance in the middle register that had always seemed like it came from the instrument's accumulated years rather than its construction. Nia sat down at it. She didn't ask. She just sat. She ran one hand across the keys lightly, getting the feel of it, finding out what it was and what it wasn't. The stuck pedal. The resonance. The way the keys were slightly heavier than she was used to. The resistance of an older instrument that had its own opinions about how it wanted to be played. She began to play. Not the album pieces. Not anything she'd performed. Something from the new material, the second album work that was still becoming itself, still finding its shape in the late-night hours at the Park Slope apartment. She played it slowly, accommodating the instrument, letting the piano's resistance shape the music rather than fighting it, and what came out was something different from what she'd had before. Slower, warmer, rougher, in the places where the old keys protested, and all of those things made it more honest rather than less. Yeran sat in the armchair near the window with her hands folded in her lap and listened. Tae-jin sat in the chair several feet from the piano. He had done many things in his life with his hands. He had signed documents that moved significant weight across the world. He had shaken the hands of men whose names most people would never know. He had held his wife's hand at his father's funeral, at her mother's, at a dozen dinners and 100 ordinary evenings. His hands had been, for most of his adult life, instruments of some kind of transaction. He placed them on his knees. He did not reach for his phone. He did not look at the door. He looked at Nia's hands moving across the keys of his mother's old piano in a sitting room in Flushing on a March Saturday, and he listened to every note with the specific attention of a man who has finally understood that listening is not a passive act, but an act of will, a choice made continuously. Something you have to decide to keep doing every few seconds because the world keeps offering you reasons to stop. He kept deciding. The music moved through the room. The stuck pedal gave the low notes a specific roughness. The resonant middle register filled the space between the furniture and the walls and the three people in it. Outside, the Queen's night was doing what it did, indifferent and alive and full of its own business. When Nia played the final phrase, she let it decay fully before she lifted her hands, giving the room time to absorb what it had just held. Silence. Then Yeran said simply, "Good." Nia looked at the keys for a moment. Then she turned on the bench and looked at Tae-jin. He had his hands on his knees, palms down. I was looking at her with the expression she had first found in the Morrison Theater corridor. Stripped of construction, honest in the particular way that cost something. And he moved one hand slightly toward her without completing the motion, the way you offer something without demanding it be taken. Nia looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She placed her hand in his. Not a resolution exactly, not an ending in the clean sense. The ring was still in a box in her apartment on a shelf above the piano, and it was going to stay there for a while longer because she was not someone who rushed back into things she needed to be certain of, and because some damage requires more than letters and honest dinners and 6 months of change to rebuild trust across. She knew this. He knew this. What they were was a beginning. Tentative, honest, built on the understanding that the old thing was finished and what came after it would need to be different in its bones, not just its surface, or it would become the old thing again. She was not going to let it become the old thing again. Neither was he. That, between two people who had finally learned how to be honest with each other, was enough to start from. Nia's hand stayed in his. The old piano's last note finished dying in the room around them. And the silence that came after it was not empty. It was the silence of something finally, carefully, beginning.